The Invisible Widow. The Duke married his late brother's plain widow, then realized he'd made the worst mistake of his life. Letting her go England, Somersetshire, 1814. The rain began at 6 in the morning. Emmeline heard the first drops strike the window sill before she even opened her eyes. In that suspended moment between sleep and waking, where the mind hasn't yet organized the weight of the day ahead. And for a brief, merciful second, she thought it was just another grey November morning in Somersetshire. Then she opened her eyes and saw the grey dress hanging on the wardrobe door. Her stomach dropped. Not just any grey. It was the grey of half-mourning, what London society called, with its particular brand of elegant cruelty, the colour a widow wore when she was no longer fully grieving, but not yet fully free. Not the deep black of the first months. Not the soft lavender that whispered she is healing, the grey of the in-between, the grey that said she still belongs to the dead, but may be lent to the living. Charles had chosen this dress for her 2 years ago, on a morning when he was in good spirits. Emmeline had learned by then that Charles Ashbourne's good spirits never lasted long enough to be trusted. She sat up slowly. The room around her was familiar. The pale walls of Whitmore Cottage, the small vanity with the cracked corner of its mirror, the single window that looked out onto the garden she had planted herself, because no one else would. 3 years she had lived in this cottage. 3 years as Charles Ashbourne's wife. 14 months as his widow. And today she would become someone else's entirely. She did not reach for the dress immediately. Instead, she sat at the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. Count the seconds between the lightning and the thunder, her mother used to say. It tells you how far away the danger is. Emmeline counted. The danger this morning was not far at all. The carriage arrived at 9:30. It was not Victor's carriage. She had not expected it to be. It belonged to the family solicitor, Mr. Aldwick, a thin man with kind eyes and the permanent expression of someone who had spent 40 years delivering news that no one wanted to hear. He handed her in with a gentleness that she appreciated precisely because it asked nothing of her in return. They did not speak much on the ride to Ashbourne Hall. Emmeline watched the countryside pass through the fogged window, the stone walls, the bare oak trees, the fields that had gone brown and still for winter. And she thought about the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. Victor Ashbourne, second son of the late Duke of Ashbourne, now Duke himself following Charles's death, had written to inform her, not ask, inform, that the terms of Charles's estate left her with very little. The cottage would revert to the Ashbourne family holdings. Her income tied to Charles's accounts would cease within the year. The letter had been precise, correct, and entirely devoid of warmth. The second letter, arriving 4 days later, had been the proposal. It is the most practical solution for both parties, Victor had written. The estate requires a duchess. You require security. I propose a marriage of arrangement, conducted with full discretion and mutual respect. I expect nothing beyond what duty requires. She had read that line, I expect nothing beyond what duty requires, sitting at her small writing desk in her small cottage in the thin afternoon light of October. And she had felt, not hurt, not anger, but something quieter and more permanent. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has already learned not to expect warmth from an Ashbourne man. She had written back the same evening. I accept. Ashbourne Hall appeared through the tree line like something from a painting, all pale stone and tall windows, Georgian columns flanking the entrance, the formal gardens stretching out on either side in perfect, severe symmetry. It was magnificent. It was cold. It looked, Emmeline thought, exactly like the man who now owned it. She had met Victor Ashbourne 4 times in her life. The first, at her wedding to Charles 4 years ago, where Victor had stood as witness with the rigid posture of a man performing an obligation. He had shaken her hand, said something correct and forgettable, moved on. The second, at a Christmas gathering at Ashbourne Hall, 2 years into her marriage, where Victor had spent the evening in conversation with men she didn't know and left before midnight without saying goodbye to anyone. The third, at Charles's funeral 14 months ago, where Victor had stood at the graveside with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on some middle distance, and had not cried. Not once. She had watched him, because she didn't know where else to look, and she had thought, he is not grieving, he is enduring. There was a difference. She knew it intimately. The fourth, the reading of the will, where he had sat across from her at a long mahogany table and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first and only time. His eyes were dark, the same dark brown as Charles's, but without the restlessness, steady, assessing. They had held her gaze for perhaps 4 seconds, and then moved on to the solicitor's papers. 4 seconds. She had counted. The ceremony took place in the Ashbourne Hall Chapel, a small private affair with only Mr. Aldwick, the housekeeper Mrs. Foyle, and 2 footmen as witnesses. No flowers. Emmeline had not asked for flowers, and Victor had not thought to provide them. This small fact, she decided, told her everything she needed to know about the years ahead. She arrived first. The chapel was lit by candlelight, and the grey wash of the November morning filtering through the high windows. She stood at the front and faced the altar and held her bouquet, a simple bundle of winter greenery that Mrs. Foyle had pressed into her hands at the last moment with an expression of quiet apology, and she breathed. Count the seconds. She counted 12 before she heard his footsteps. Victor Ashbourne walked into the chapel the way he apparently did everything, with the precise, measured efficiency of a man who had somewhere more important to be. He wore dark blue, almost black, a coat that fit him with the severe perfection of a man who wore his clothing like armor. His cravat was white and exact. His dark hair was brushed back. He looked, she thought, exactly like a duke was supposed to look. He did not look at her. He took his place beside her, facing the altar, and the vicar, summoned for the occasion with the same brisk practicality that Victor apparently applied to all things, opened his book and began. Emmeline stood very still. She was aware of Victor's height. He was taller than Charles had been, broader through the shoulders, with a stillness to him that Charles had never possessed. She was aware of the scent of him, faint and clean, something like cedar and cold morning air. She was aware that his hands, clasped in front of him, were absolutely motionless. She was aware that he had not looked at her once. The vicar spoke the words. Emmeline answered when she was meant to answer. Victor answered when he was meant to answer, his voice low and even and completely controlled. When the vicar instructed him to take her hand, he did so with the careful precision of a man handling something fragile. His fingers were cool. His grip was brief. He released her hand the moment the vicar moved on. With this ring, the vicar read, and Victor placed the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, no stone, and she felt the weight of it settle there like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. The vicar said, "You may now." Victor said, "Thank you, Reverend Hale." Just like that, stepping past the moment entirely. Emmeline looked down at her hand, at the ring, at the small, dull gleam of gold against her skin. She did not feel married. She felt, if she was being precise about it, exactly the same as she had before, only now with better financial security. They ate dinner that evening at opposite ends of a table that could have seated 20. The dining room at Ashbourne Hall was everything that the chapel had been, beautiful, immaculate, cold. Candelabras threw warm light across silver and crystal, across the portrait of the first Duke of Ashbourne that hung above the fireplace, across the careful arrangement of the table that Mrs. Foyle had clearly assembled with tremendous effort. There were flowers on the table, Emmeline noticed. Someone had remembered. She suspected Mrs. Foyle. Victor sat at the head of the table. She sat at the far end. Between them, 10 empty chairs, 4 candelabras, and a silence so thoroughly established it had begun to feel architectural. The food was excellent. She ate it without tasting much. Halfway through the second course, Victor spoke. "I trust the East Wing rooms are satisfactory." His voice carried easily across the distance. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising his volume. "They are," Emmeline said. "Thank you." Silence resumed. A footman refilled her wine glass. She watched the candlelight move against the crystal and thought about the East Wing rooms, spacious, well-furnished, and located at the precise maximum distance from Victor's own apartments that the floor plan of Ashbourne Hall allowed. She had noticed this immediately. She suspected it had been intentional. She did not particularly mind. "You will have full use of the household accounts for domestic management," Victor said. "Mrs. Foyle will defer to you on matters of the house. My schedule will not require adjustment." "Of course," Emmeline said. Another silence. "Is there anything you require that has not been arranged?" She considered the question. She considered the long table between them, the empty chairs, the portrait of his ancestor watching over the room with the particular arrogance of men who never doubted their right to occupy space. "No," she said, "everything has been arranged." Something shifted in his expression. She was too far away to read it clearly, but she thought for just a moment that she saw something move behind his eyes, not quite discomfort, not quite relief, something in between. "Good," he said. And that was the entirety of their wedding dinner. She could not sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep had been a negotiation since Charles died. Some nights it came easily. Some nights it required patience, and some nights it simply declined to appear at all. She had made peace with this mostly. She had learned to use the sleepless hours for reading, or for sitting at the window with a candle and watching the gardens below, which were beautiful even in winter, especially in winter, when the bare bones of everything were visible. She wrapped herself in the heavy shawl she'd brought from the cottage. Navy wool slightly worn at the left cuff, the only thing she'd kept that had been purely her own, and she carried her candle to the window seat of her new rooms, and she sat and she looked out at the gardens of Ashbourne Hall. The rain had stopped, the grounds were silver and still under a thin slice of moon. The formal hedgerows cast long shadows across the gravel paths. The fountain at the centre of the east garden had been shut off for winter, its basin holding a shallow mirror of dark water. She looked at her hand. The ring caught the candlelight. She thought about Charles, not with grief anymore, not the sharp kind, but with the dull and honest weight of someone who had grieved fully and come out the other side. She thought about the morning he had chosen this dress for her. The afternoon he had told her, with a kind of careless cruelty she didn't think was entirely intentional, that she was not what he'd imagined. She thought about all the ways she had tried, in 3 years of marriage, to become something worth imagining, and all the ways it had made no difference. She was done trying to be imagined. That was the one freedom this new arrangement offered her. Victor Ashbourne expected nothing beyond duty. She would deliver duty. She would manage his household with competence and silence. She would appear at his side when London required it. She would take up no more space than necessary, and perhaps, in the smallness of that existence, she would finally find something that belonged to her alone. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and breathed. Below, in the garden, a light moved. She sat up, a single lantern crossing the east garden path at a measured pace. She recognized the silhouette without difficulty, the height, the set of the shoulders, the particular stillness even in motion that she had already learned to identify. Victor, walking alone in his garden at midnight. She watched him without thinking about it. The lantern moving between the hedgerows, pausing at the edge of the fountain, the light going still as he stood there for a long moment looking at the dark water. He was not wearing his coat. Just his white shirt in the cold night air, the sleeves rolled slightly, the lantern hanging from one hand. He looked, from up here, like someone who had not slept in a long time. He looked, she thought, and then stopped herself from finishing the thought. She let the curtain fall back into place. She returned to the window seat, pulled the shawl tighter, opened the book she'd brought with her, Sense and Sensibility, 3rd reading, and found her page. She did not look out the window again. But for a long time she was aware of the lantern light below, moving through the dark garden alone. The ring on her finger was cool and unfamiliar. The house around her was vast and perfectly silent, and somewhere below, the new Duke of Ashbourne walked his garden at midnight, as she would later learn he did every single night. She did not know yet what he was walking away from. She did not know yet that one day it would matter very much. There was a particular art to being invisible inside a large house. Emmeline had learned it during her 3 years at Whitmore Cottage, the art of occupying space without claiming it, of being present without demanding acknowledgement, of moving through rooms and corridors in such a way that one's passage left no disturbance in the air. It was not a skill she had been taught. It was a skill she had developed slowly and without pleasure in the company of a man who found her presence vaguely inconvenient. At Ashbourne Hall, invisibility was not difficult. The house was enormous, 3 floors of pale stone and high-ceilinged rooms, corridors that went on long enough to make one forget where one had started, a library that occupied the entire north-facing side of the 2nd floor, a music room no one had used in years, a morning room, an afternoon room, a yellow sitting room whose purpose Emmeline had not yet determined. There were 31 rooms in the main house and another 14 in the east and west wings. She had counted. Victor occupied perhaps 4 of them with any regularity. His study, the dining room for dinner only, breakfast he took in his rooms, and the midday meal he apparently did not take at all, the library late at night, and the stables where Mrs. Foyle had mentioned, with a careful neutrality that suggested she was choosing her words, that His Grace spends a considerable amount of time. The rest of Ashbourne Hall belonged, in practice, to no one. Emmeline moved into it quietly. Within the first week she walked every corridor, not to explore, and she was not given to sentimentality about grand houses, but to understand. The east wing needed attention. 2 rooms with damp coming through the north-facing walls, a fireplace in the 2nd guest room that drew badly and would smoke by midwinter, a section of the rear servants' corridor where the floorboards had grown soft and would need replacing before they became dangerous. She wrote these observations in a small notebook she kept in her dress pocket. On the 8th day, she brought the notebook to Mrs. Foyle. The housekeeper, a tall woman in her 50s with iron-grey hair and the brisk competence of someone who had run this household through 2 generations of Ashbourne men, looked at the list with an expression that moved in the space of a few seconds through surprise, assessment, and something that settled into quiet respect. "The floorboard in the servants' corridor," Mrs. Foyle said. "I submitted that to Mr. Hartley 3 months ago." "Mr. Hartley?" "The estate steward. He submitted it to His Grace." A pause. "It has not been attended to." Emmeline nodded. "I'll need the household accounts as well when you have a moment. His Grace mentioned they were at my disposal." Mrs. Foyle looked at her for one long measuring moment. Then she said, "I'll have them on your desk this afternoon, Your Grace." And that, without ceremony or particular acknowledgement, was how Emmeline Ashbourne became the person who actually ran Ashbourne Hall. The staff, she discovered, were its own kind of text, one that could be read, if you paid attention, more accurately than anything written. Thomas, the head footman, had been with the family for 11 years and moved through the house with the particular pride of someone who considered the building's dignity a personal responsibility. He polished things that were already polished. He straightened things that were already straight. He noticed, Emmeline observed, every time she thanked him for something, a small flicker in his expression each time, as though thanks were not part of his expected vocabulary here. Mary, the upstairs maid assigned to Emmeline's rooms, was 19 and nervous in the way of someone who had been corrected frequently. She spoke in half sentences and apologized for things that required no apology. On the 3rd morning, she knocked over a small vase while dusting, so it was a plain ceramic piece worth nothing, and went so pale with alarm that Emmeline crossed the room immediately and picked it up herself. "It isn't broken," Emmeline said, "and it wouldn't have mattered much if it were." Mary looked at her as though this were a sentence in a foreign language. After that, she stopped flinching when Emmeline entered a room. "Cook, Mrs." Bateman, a broad Yorkshire woman who ran her kitchen with military precision, warmed to Emmeline on the 2nd Thursday when Emmeline walked into the kitchen to ask, directly and without apology, whether Cook preferred to plan the week's menus herself or whether she would like suggestions. The question itself, apparently, was unusual enough to earn her a scrutinizing look, followed by a plate of shortbread and a 40-minute conversation about seasonal provisions. Emmeline ate the shortbread and listened carefully. She was always listening. What she learned gradually through 100 small conversations and careful silences was this: Victor Ashbourne was not a cruel man. He was a distant one. There was a difference, and she was perhaps more aware of it than most women would have been, having spent 3 years with a man who had occasionally been both. Victor did not speak harshly to the staff. He did not make unreasonable demands. He paid fair wages and kept the household properly provisioned, and expected his instructions to be followed, which they were, because he gave them clearly and without unnecessary elaboration. But he did not see people, not in the way that made them feel human. He saw functions, he saw roles. Thomas was the footman, Mrs. Foyle was the housekeeper, the grooms were the grooms. They were part of the machinery of Ashbourne Hall, well maintained and respected in the abstract, and entirely invisible as individuals. This, Emmeline understood, was simply how he had been made. She did not judge it. She had been made by similar hands. On the 14th day of November 1814, Emmeline found the error. She had been working through the household accounts for 3 days, not because she had been asked to, but because numbers had always made sense to her in a way that people sometimes didn't, and because the books Mrs. Foyle had provided were, to a careful eye, slightly wrong in a way that compounded quietly over time. She sat at the writing desk in her sitting room, with a pot of tea going cold beside her, and the account book spread open and the small notebook filling slowly with her observations. The error was not dramatic. It was the kind of error that was easy to miss precisely because it was small. A recurring discrepancy in the quarterly provisions billing, an amount that appeared slightly inflated each time, consistent enough to suggest pattern rather than mistake. Over 2 years, the cumulative sum was not insignificant. She checked her arithmetic 3 times, then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about what to do. The obvious answer was to bring it directly to Mr. Hartley, the estate steward. The correct answer, she decided, the one that would actually result in the matter being resolved without creating a protracted argument about a new duchess overstepping, was to bring it to Victor. She did not particularly want to bring anything to Victor. In 14 days of marriage, their total conversation had amounted to perhaps 20 exchanges, none of which had lasted longer than 4 minutes, all of which had been conducted with the polite efficiency of 2 strangers sharing a train compartment. He spoke to her at dinner, briefly about household matters, and occasionally crossed her path in the corridors, where he would acknowledge her with a nod of precisely the same warmth he extended to Thomas and the furniture. She was not wounded by this. She had expected nothing else. But she knocked on his study door at 4 o'clock that afternoon, because the ledger required it, and because Emmeline Ashbourne, whatever else she was or was not, did not leave errors unaddressed. His voice came from inside immediately. "Come." The study was everything she might have predicted, large, ordered, every surface arranged with the precision of a man who found disorder physically uncomfortable. Books shelved by size, papers stacked in exact parallel. A desk that faced the window so that the light came from the left, practical, intentional. The fire was burning efficiently in the grate. 2 chairs sat across from the desk. No cushions. Victor was standing at the window when she entered, holding a letter. He turned when she came in, and his expression did what it always did when he looked at her, moved through a brief calibration, as though he were reminding himself of a fact he kept nearly forgetting, and settled into careful neutrality. "Duchess." "I apologize for the interruption." She crossed to his desk and laid the account book open to the relevant page, along with her notebook. "I've been reviewing the household accounts. There is a discrepancy in the provisions billing that I believe requires your attention." He came to the desk, stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, and looked at what she had marked. A silence. He reached past her for her notebook, read her calculations. His brow drew together slightly, the most expression she had seen on his face since the wedding. "This goes back 2 years, he said. "Yes." Hartley reviewed these accounts quarterly. "Yes." He looked at the numbers again. Something moved through his expression, not anger, but a kind of controlled tightening, like a cord pulled taut. He set the notebook down. "I'll speak with Hartley today." "I thought you should see it directly," Emmeline said, "rather than through an intermediary." He turned to look at her then, truly look at her, with those steady dark eyes that she had counted 4 seconds of once, and not experienced again since. The look lasted longer this time. 6 seconds. 7. She met his gaze without difficulty. She had learned, a long time ago, not to drop her eyes for men who had not yet earned her deference. "Thank you," Victor said. The words were simple. His voice was even. But there was something underneath them, a faint, almost imperceptible shift, that she filed away in the same part of her mind she kept everything important. She nodded, gathered her notebook, walked to the door. "Duchess." She stopped. "How long did this take you?" he asked. "To find it." She considered the question honestly. 3 days, she said. "But I was also learning the filing system." Another silence. "Hartley has had 2 years, Victor said. Not to her, quite. More to the room. More to himself." Emmeline said nothing. She opened the door and left him there with the account books and the afternoon light, and whatever it was that moved behind his eyes when he thought no one was watching. That evening at dinner, Victor arrived at the table before her for the first time. He was standing at the window when she entered, not sitting, not pretending to read, just standing, looking out at the garden with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she came in, and for a moment, just a moment, his eyes moved over her with a quality slightly different from their usual brief calibration. She sat at her end of the table. He sat at his. The footman served the first course. The candles burned. The portrait of the first Duke watched them from above the fireplace. "You were Charles's wife for 3 years, Victor said, midway through the soup course. It was not phrased as a question, but it was. "Yes," Emmeline said. He was not. Victor paused. The pause had weight. He was not an easy man. She looked down at her spoon, at the small, perfect reflection of candlelight in the silver. "No," she said. He was not. Another pause. "I am told," Victor said carefully, "that you managed Whitmore Cottage largely without assistance. There wasn't much assistance available." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "There should have been." She looked up at that. He was looking at his plate. His jaw was set in that particular way she had begun to associate with things he found difficult to say and said anyway, because precision mattered to him more than comfort. She didn't respond, because there was no response that wouldn't complicate something that was for now just barely manageable. But she noted it. She noted everything. She returned to her rooms that night and sat at the window for a long time before she reached for her book. The garden below was dark and still. No lantern moved across the paths. She looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about Charles saying, "You are not what I imagined." She thought about 3 years of careful smallness, of making herself compact and undemanding and apologetically present. She thought about the moment this morning when she had stood at Victor's desk and not dropped her eyes. 6 seconds. 7. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. But Emmeline had learned, very early, to find shelter in small things. She opened her book. Outside, the first frost of winter crept quietly across the Ashbourne gardens, silvering the gravel paths and the empty fountain basin, settling over everything with the patient, indifferent beauty of something that neither knew nor cared that it was being watched. She had entered Ashbourne Hall as a transaction, as a signature on a document, as a practical solution. She had not expected to matter here. She had in fact arranged her entire interior life around not expecting to matter. What she did not yet know, what neither of them knew, was that the house was already changing around her. Quietly, without announcement. The way frost changes everything it touches before anyone thinks to look. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Emmeline was in the morning room reviewing the winter provision orders when Mrs. Foyle brought it in on a small silver tray, with the expression of someone delivering a document of mild consequence. It bore the crest of Lord and Lady Pembridge, the foremost family in the county, the kind of people whose invitations were less requests and more elegant instructions, and it requested the presence of the Duke of Ashbourne and his Duchess at the Winter Assembly Ball at Pembridge House on the 22nd of November. Mrs. Foyle said, "His Grace has already received his copy," which meant, Emmeline understood, that Victor had already decided whether they were going. She found out at dinner. "The Pembridge Ball," Victor said, not looking up from his wine-glass. "The 22nd. Your presence will be expected." Not "I hope you will join me," not "would you be willing." Your presence will be expected. The grammar of obligation, efficient and total. "Of course," Emmeline said. "I will require you beside me for the first hour. After that you are free to conduct yourself as you see fit." He looked up briefly. "I assume you are comfortable in those circumstances." I assume you are comfortable. Not a question, either. Perfectly, she said. He nodded, returned to his wine. She returned to her dinner, and privately, in the quiet of her own thoughts, she made a single decision. She would not wear grey. It took her 2 days to find it. Not because she had many options. She did not. Her wardrobe from Whitmore Cottage was practical and narrow, built for the life of a widow on a limited income, and most of it was indeed grey, or the close cousin of grey, or the kind of blue that had decided not to commit. But in the very back of the trunk she had brought from the cottage, below the winter shawls and the extra petticoats and the copy of Persuasion she kept as a spare, she found it. She had bought the fabric 3 years ago, in a moment of uncharacteristic extravagance, at a market in Bath before her marriage to Charles. A silk brocade in deep slate blue, with a faint silver thread woven through that was only visible in good light. She had never made it into anything. Charles had asked once what it was for, and she had said a dress, and he had looked at it with the mild distaste he reserved for things that drew attention, and she had folded it back into the trunk and not thought about it again. She thought about it now. She called for the seamstress from the village. The woman came the next morning and looked at the fabric and said, "Oh, my lady, this is lovely." It was the unprompted enthusiasm that decided it. The carriage ride to Pembridge House took 40 minutes. Victor sat across from her, not beside, across, and spent the first 20 minutes reading a document from his coat pocket and the last 20 looking out the window with the expression he wore when he was thinking about something he would not be saying aloud. He was dressed, as always, in dark colours. Tonight a coat of deep midnight blue that fit him with that severe precision that she suspected was simply the natural result of a body built to wear such things. His cravat was perfectly tied. He did not look at her. She looked out her own window and watched the hedgerows pass in the dark, and thought about nothing in particular, and breathed. When the carriage stopped and the footman opened the door, Victor stepped out first and offered his hand to assist her down. This was the protocol. She took his hand, the brief, cool contact, and stepped down onto the gravel drive. Pembridge House blazed with light. Through the tall windows she could see the movement of figures, the warm tumble of candlelight and firelight, hear the first strands of the orchestra drifting out into the cold November air. Around them other carriages were arriving, other couples stepping out in pools of lamplight. Victor offered her his arm. She placed her hand on it, and they walked into Pembridge House as the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, which they were, and which looked, from the outside exactly like a marriage. The entrance hall erupted quietly, in the way that London society erupted, not loudly, but thoroughly. Heads turned, conversations adjusted. Emmeline was aware of the assessments landing on her from every direction, the particular quality of attention that a new duchess received at her first public appearance, that mix of curiosity and calculation and social hunger that she had encountered in a milder form even as Charles's wife. She kept her chin level. She kept her hand steady on Victor's arm. Lord and Lady Pembridge received them near the entrance, a warm, broad-shouldered man of 60, and his wife, a sharp-eyed woman in burgundy who took Emmeline's measure in approximately 2 seconds and apparently arrived at an acceptable conclusion because her smile warmed genuinely. "Your Grace," Lady Pembridge said, and her eyes moved over the dress with the unhurried appreciation of a woman who knew fabric. "What a remarkable colour." "Thank you," Emmeline said simply. Beside her she felt Victor's arm shift very slightly, not enough to mean anything, just shift. The first hour proceeded according to instruction. Emmeline stood beside Victor. She was introduced to people whose names she catalogued carefully, the county families, the minor lords, the ambitious younger sons, the wives who ran their households and consequently ran most of the county's actual business. She said the correct things. She smiled at the correct moments. She asked questions that demonstrated interest without requiring long answers, which was the social skill she had most thoroughly mastered in a marriage spent learning to fill silences that no one else would. Victor was beside her throughout, present, composed, conducting himself with the controlled ease of a man fully at home in his social authority. He spoke to men she didn't know about things she understood: politics, estate matters, the winter session of Parliament. He did not speak to her specifically, but when she was addressed he was attentive in his peripheral way. The way he was attentive to everything, accurately, thoroughly, without warmth. Once, when the wife of a magistrate asked her a question about Ashbourne Hall's gardens, and Emmeline answered in some detail, because she had in fact been studying the garden plans and had thoughts about the east section's drainage, she became aware that Victor had half-turned beside her. Not to interrupt. Just to listen. She did not look at him. She finished her answer. The magistrate's wife was delighted. Victor turned back to his own conversation. At the 1-hour mark, precise as clockwork, Victor said, "You are at liberty." Quietly, for her ears only. "I have matters to attend to for the next while. Foyle mentioned you are acquainted with the Selwyn family. I believe Miss Selwyn is here this evening." "Thank you," Emmeline said. She released his arm. And then, this was the part she would think about later, lying awake at midnight with the frost outside her window. He looked at her. Directly. The full dark consideration of those eyes, for the second time since she had stood at his desk. Not long. 3 seconds, perhaps. As though he were checking something. As though he were solving or failing to solve a small and puzzling equation. Then he nodded and walked away. She watched him go without meaning to. She found Miss Selwyn near the refreshment table, exactly as predicted, and spent a pleasant 20 minutes in her company before Miss Selwyn was claimed by her mother for a duty introduction, and Emmeline found herself holding a glass of champagne and perfectly, contentedly alone. She did not mind being alone at parties. She had been alone at most of them. She drifted toward the edge of the room, where the crowd thinned and the sound of the orchestra filled the air more fully, and she stood and listened and watched the room with the quiet attention she brought to everything. "You look," said a voice beside her, "like a woman who would rather be somewhere with better books." She turned. The man beside her was perhaps 35, with sandy hair and an easy smile, and the relaxed posture of someone entirely comfortable in social situations, the opposite, in nearly every visible way, of Victor. He bowed. "Forgive me, Lord Ashfield. James. We met once, years ago, at a Pembridge Christmas. You were Charles Ashbourne's wife then, I believe." "I was," Emmeline said, "and am now the other one." He laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that made several nearby people turn. "Victor Ashbourne's Duchess, yes. The county has talked of very little else for the past month." He looked at her with open curiosity that was, somehow, not unpleasant. "How are you finding Ashbourne Hall?" "Cold," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is always cold." She looked at him. "You know it?" "I grew up on the neighbouring estate. Victor and I were adjacent in childhood. We were never quite friends. He didn't do friends particularly." He paused. "He was always, I don't know the right word, elsewhere, even when he was in the room." "Elsewhere." She turned the word over. "The books," Lord Ashfield said, nodding at her. "I was right, wasn't I?" "You were not wrong," Emmeline said. He smiled. "Are you enjoying the ball at least?" She considered the question honestly. "I'm enjoying this part of it," she said. He laughed again. Diplomatic and truthful at once, a rare combination. She was not aware at first that Victor had come to stand on the far side of the room. She became aware of it gradually, a particular quality of stillness in her peripheral vision, a presence that her body, apparently, had already learned to register. She did not look immediately. She finished her sentence to Lord Ashfield about the merits of the East County Lending Library. She laughed once, briefly, at something he said about the Pembridge hounds. Then, naturally, she glanced toward the opposite wall. Victor was standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine and 2 men she didn't recognize. He was in profile to her. She could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. The 2 men were talking. He appeared to be listening, but his eyes were on her, not quickly, not covertly, openly, with that steady, assessing quality, the way he looked at account books and legal documents and things he was trying to understand. When her gaze found his, he did not look away. She did. She turned back to Lord Ashfield and said something, she couldn't have reconstructed what, and lifted her champagne glass and felt the warmth of the firelight on her back and the odd, unsettled weight of a look she had not expected. Later, much later, she would try to name what she had felt in that moment, She would not find the word, but she would remember, very precisely, the silver thread in the fabric of her dress, the way it had only been visible in good light, and the fact that, apparently, Victor Ashbourne had been standing in exactly the right position to see it. She had worn the blue dress as a private act of defiance. She had not worn it for him. She had not worn it for Lord Ashfield either, though he had noticed it. She had worn it, if she was honest, for herself. For the woman who had kept a bolt of beautiful fabric in a trunk for 3 years, and finally had a reason, or at least a willingness, to take it out. Victor Ashbourne, standing across a candle-lit room with a glass of wine and a steady, unreadable gaze, had not been part of the plan. He never was. She heard him before she saw him. The library at Ashbourne Hall occupied the entire north-facing side of the second floor. A long, high-ceilinged room lined floor to ceiling with shelves that held what Emmeline estimated was somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 volumes. 2 fireplaces at either end. Reading chairs positioned with the practical precision of someone who used the room for actual reading rather than display. A long central table, a pair of rolling ladders on brass rails. The smell of old paper and wood smoke, and something she couldn't name, but that she had begun to associate inescapably with the particular atmosphere of rooms where someone had spent a great deal of time being alone. She had come here at 11, when sleep declined its invitation. It was now past 2 in the morning. She had been sitting in the chair nearest the west fireplace for 3 hours, deeply inside Sense and Sensibility, her 4th reading of it, which made it less like reading and more like returning. With her feet tucked up beneath her, and the shawl pulled close and a single candle on the small table beside her that she kept having to relight. She was at the part where Eleanor holds everything together while falling apart invisibly, which was the part she always read the longest. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She did not move. They stopped outside the library door. A pause. 4 seconds. 5, 6. Then the door opened. Victor came in carrying a lantern. He did not immediately see her. He came several steps into the room, set the lantern on the central table, and turned toward the shelves on the east wall with the focused purposefulness of someone who had come for a specific book and intended to retrieve it and leave. He wore a dark dressing gown over his shirt and trousers, the neck of his shirt open without cravat, the first time she had seen him without the formal armor of complete dress. He looked different. She noticed it before she could choose not to. He pulled a book from the second shelf, turned and stopped. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the long room, she in her chair with her feet tucked up, and her candle and her novel. He standing by the shelves with his lantern and his book and the dark dressing gown, both of them equally unprepared for the other's presence. Then Victor said, "I didn't know anyone was here." "I often am," Emmeline said, "at this hour." A pause. "So am I," he said. He did not leave. He stood for a moment with his book and his lantern, and she thought he was calculating his options. Retreat, which would be awkward, the far end of the room, which would be deliberate, or the other chair by the west fireplace, which was simply where you sat when you were in this part of the library at this hour. He came and sat in the other chair. She moved her feet off the cushion, straightened slightly. He set the lantern on the mantelpiece and leaned back in the chair and opened his book, and for 10 minutes they sat in silence on opposite sides of the fireplace and read, and the fire burned down quietly between them. It was, Emmeline thought, the most comfortable she had felt at Ashbourne Hall. She turned a page. Across from her, Victor turned a page. The clock on the library mantel ticked. Outside the north-facing windows, the winter night pressed close and still. "What are you reading?" he said. She turned the cover slightly so he could see the spine. He made a sound, not quite dismissive, not quite approval. "Again?" She looked at him. "You've seen me with it before?" "In the morning room, last week." He looked at the fire. "You were laughing." She had been. Mrs. Ferrars's entrance in the second volume. She had laughed involuntarily and then looked up immediately, the way one did when one laughed aloud in a house where laughter felt presumptuous. "I didn't realize you were paying attention," she said. "I was passing the door." His voice was even. "What is it about that book that you keep returning to?" She considered the question seriously because it was a serious question, asked without irony or small talk. "Eleanor," she said. "The older sister. She is. She contains everything. All the feeling is there. She simply doesn't perform it for the people around her. I find her more interesting each time." "Because she keeps things inside," he said. "Because she keeps things intact," Emmeline corrected gently. "That's different. Keeping something inside suggests it's hidden. She isn't hiding it. She simply holds it, very carefully, so it doesn't break." He looked at her. Not the brief calibration, not the accounting desk assessment. Something different. Something that arrived more slowly and settled with more weight, like a stone placed quietly on a table rather than thrown. "You've read everything on the left side of the east wall," he said after a moment. She blinked. "How do you know that?" "The spines." He nodded toward the east wall, invisible in the current darkness. "I can tell when a book has been taken down and replaced. The angle changes slightly. A pause that might, in another person, have been sheepishness. I notice books." "So do I," she said. "Yes," he said. "I had begun to think that." They talked for 2 hours. Afterwards, she would find it difficult to reconstruct exactly how it had started. One book led to another, one observation to a question to an honest answer that invited another question, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th hour of the morning, they had covered Austen Richardson, the relative merits of the French versus English traditions in fiction, the particular problem with novels that didn't trust their readers, the question of whether any book you read at 20 meant the same thing at 30, and the role of silence in good writing, and in good anything else, she had said, not meaning it as a revelation, but he had gone very still for a moment when she said it. He had read everything she had read, some of it more times than she had. He had opinions, real ones, precise and considered, and occasionally wrong in interesting ways that made disagreement worthwhile. When she pushed back on something he said about Tom Jones, "I think you're confusing intelligence with irony. They're not the same quality." He didn't deflect or concede out of politeness. He argued. He brought evidence from the text. He changed his position on one point and defended another with quiet stubbornness, and at some point she realized she was leaning forward in her chair, and the fire had burned very low. "You're surprised," he said. "By what?" "That I can hold a conversation." He said it without accusation, simply observed it. "I'm not surprised," she said carefully. "I didn't know what to expect." "That's different." He looked at the fire. Something moved across his face. A complex, layered thing that she could not fully read from where she sat, but that she recognized in the way one recognizes a landscape seen through fog. The shapes were familiar, even if the details were unclear. "My father," he said, and stopped. She waited. "He believed that showing feeling was a form of weakness, that a man of our position—" He paused again. The pause cost him something. She could see that it cost him something. He was very thorough in that instruction. The fire crackled. She did not fill the silence. "Charles was the same," he said, quieter. "Or not the same. He had the feeling and could not contain it, which made him erratic. Whereas I—" He stopped. "Contained it too well," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not criticizing," she said quickly. "I understand the instinct. I've had the same one." "You?" The word came with genuine skepticism. "I'm much better at it than I appear," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her across the dying fire with those steady dark eyes, and she had the unsettling, unlooked-for impression that he was seeing her, actually seeing her, for perhaps the first time since she had arrived at Ashbourne Hall. 6 seconds, 7, 8. She looked down at her book. "The fire is nearly out," she said. "Yes." He did not move immediately. "I should let you sleep." "I rarely sleep much," she said. "At this hour." "Nor do I." She looked up. He was standing now, lantern in hand, and the light caught the line of his face from below, the jaw, the shadows under his eyes, the particular expression of a man who has said more than he intended and is not yet sure how he feels about it. "Good night, Duchess," he said. "Good night," she said. And then, because it felt, for reasons she couldn't entirely justify, like the right thing. "Victor." his name in her voice. For the first time, the briefest pause. "Good night, Emmeline," he said, and walked out of the library with the lantern, leaving her alone in the darkness, with the last orange pulse of the fire and the smell of old books, and the particular bewildering sensation of having been genuinely known by someone she had expected nothing from at all. She sat for a long time after he left. She did not try to name what she was feeling. She simply held it, very carefully, the way Eleanor would, so it didn't break. December came to Ashbourne Hall the way it came to all large houses, without announcement, but with complete conviction. The temperature dropped. The last of the autumn colour left the gardens, and what remained was beautiful in the way of things reduced to their essentials: bare branches against white sky, frost on stone, the fountain basin frozen solid by the second week of the month. Mrs. Bateman began making the spiced preparations that filled the entire ground floor with cinnamon and clove. Thomas hung evergreen arrangements in the entrance hall. The house became incrementally warmer in the small ways that mattered, not in architecture but in atmosphere. The accumulated effect of fires kept burning, and good smells, and the invisible effort of a household staff that was, Emmeline had come to understand, genuinely invested in this place. She was invested in it too now. She had not planned to be. She had planned, at most, competence. She had planned to manage Ashbourne Hall with the same quiet efficiency with which she had managed everything else, adequately, invisibly, without particular feeling. But something had happened between October and December that she had not accounted for. She had begun to care, not dramatically, not in a way that frightened her. But she caught herself sometimes, standing at the window of her sitting room and looking out at the frost-silvered garden with a feeling that was something adjacent to belonging, cautious, conditional belonging, like an animal that has found a warm place to shelter and is not yet certain whether it will be permitted to stay. She did not examine this feeling too closely. She had learned the danger of that. The library had become a kind of quiet agreement. Neither of them had spoken about the night they'd spent reading by the dying fire. There had been no moment of acknowledgement, no adjustment in the formal register of their daytime interactions, no reference to Victor or Emmeline in the light of day. But the library had changed. She came at 11, he came, not every night, but regularly, sometime after midnight. He would take a chair. She would continue reading. One of them would speak eventually, or neither would, and either was entirely acceptable. They had argued about Wordsworth and agreed about Keats, and sat in complete silence for an hour on a night when she had a headache, and he appeared to be working through something dark and private that she did not ask about. He had brought her tea once, set it on the small table beside her chair without comment. She had said thank you without looking up from her page. It was the closest thing to domestic ease she had experienced in years. She held it carefully. She did not call it what it was. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday evening in early December. She had been composing it in her mind for 2 weeks, not the specific words, but the intention behind them, the structure of what she needed to say and why, and whether saying it was wise or simply honest, and whether, in this particular context, those were the same thing. She sat at her desk with a fresh sheet of paper and the correct pen and the firelight casting a warm and dishonest glow over everything, and she wrote. It took her 4 drafts. She burned the first 3. The fourth was 3 paragraphs, formal, correct, precise. She read it twice, changed one word, folded it, sealed it with plain wax, and addressed it. His Grace the Duke of Ashbourne. She gave it to Thomas in the morning with instructions to deliver it to His Grace's study. Then she went about her day. She reviewed the winter provisioning with Mrs. Bateman. She met with the carpenter about the east wing floorboards, finally being attended to. She walked the garden for 30 minutes in the early afternoon, which she did when the weather permitted, and often when it didn't. She had tea with Mrs. Foyle and discussed the Christmas household arrangements and the question of whether His Grace would require the formal dining room for any particular occasions. She ate dinner at her end of the table. Victor's chair was empty. He often dined away from the house when Parliament business kept him in the county. She did not ask about it. She returned to her rooms and sat at the window and waited. He knocked at 9 o'clock. She called him in. He entered with the letter in his hand, held loosely, the way he held documents he had read thoroughly and was still thinking about. He stood in the center of her sitting room, not advancing to the chairs, not retreating to the door, simply standing in the middle with that deliberate stillness, and looked at her. She was sitting at the window. She did not rise. "You want an annulment," he said. His voice was even. It was always even. "I want to go to Bath," she said. "There is a position there with the Clifford family, a tutoring arrangement, their 2 daughters. It was offered through my cousin in November. I've been considering it." "You want to leave Ashbourne Hall?" "I want a life of my own." She said it simply, not with anger, not with apology, simply the way she said true things. "You have been... This has been..." She paused, choosing. "I have found more here than I expected. I want you to know that. But we made an arrangement based on practical necessity, and the necessity has changed for me. I have options now. I thought it was honest to tell you." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode from where she sat, something that moved through several registers in quick succession, like light through a shutter. "The Clifford family," he said. "Yes." "In Bath?" "Yes." A silence. "This is... You have thought about this carefully." Not a question. "Yes." He looked at the letter, at the neat fold of it, the plain wax seal. He looked at it for a long moment, as though it contained something he had failed to read the first time. "Is there something—" He stopped, started again with the particular quality she had come to recognize, the sound of a man who chose words the way a surgeon chose instruments, with care and consequence. "Is there something at Ashbourne Hall that has made this necessary, something that has been inadequate in the arrangement?" She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said honestly. "That's rather the point." He frowned slightly. "I don't follow." "If something had been wrong," she said, "I would have addressed it. That's what I do. I find the error and I address it. But there is no error here, Victor. You have been correct in everything. The house is well run. The arrangement has been respected. You have given me every practical thing you promised." "Then what?" "You have given me everything except a reason to stay." She said it gently, without cruelty. "And I am not blaming you for that. I knew the terms when I agreed to them, but I am 31 years old and I have spent the past 4 years either waiting for a man to see me or accepting that he wouldn't. I would like, before much more time passes, to simply live. In a place where I am chosen, rather than convenient." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the December wind moved through the bare oak trees with a sound like pages turning. Victor stood absolutely still in the center of her sitting room, with the letter in his hand and an expression that she had never seen on his face before. Not the controlled neutrality, not the assessing steadiness, but something rawer and less managed, something that had arrived faster than he could cover it. He said nothing for a very long time. "I see," he said finally. "I thought you should hear it directly," she said, "rather than through a solicitor." He nodded once, looked at the letter again, folded it with his thumb along the crease. "I will need to consider the legal dimensions," he said. The measured voice returned, the professional distance gathered back around him like a coat put on in cold weather. "Of course," Emmeline said. "I will have an answer for you within the week." "Thank you." He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to her, his shoulders set in that way she had catalogued, that particular line of a man carrying something he had decided not to put down. He did not turn around. "Good night, Emmeline," he said. It was the 3rd time he had said her name. She counted. "Good night," she said. The door closed. She sat very still at the window for a long time after his footsteps faded down the corridor. She had said what was true. She had said it cleanly and without excess, and yet she pressed 2 fingers against the glass of the window, cold against her skin, and looked out at the dark garden below and waited for the feeling of relief that she had expected to arrive. It did not come. The lantern appeared at 11:30. She had not gone to the library. She had sat at her window instead with her shawl and her cooling tea, and the particular restlessness of a decision already made that the body had not yet accepted. She was watching the garden, not for anything, simply watching, when the light appeared at the east garden door. Victor. He walked the path slowly tonight, Not with the measured, habitual pace she had observed in previous nights, purposeful strides that covered the circuit of the garden efficiently, as though even insomnia required management. Tonight he walked differently. He stopped at the fountain more than once. He stood at the far end of the path near the stone bench for a long time, with the lantern held at his side and his face turned toward the house. She could not see his expression from here. She was not sure she needed to. He stood there for a very long time. She watched him without moving, her forehead almost touching the glass, her breath fogging slightly against it. The wind had died. The garden was completely still around him. The frozen fountain, the bare hedgerows, the pale gravel path, and the lantern cast his shadow long and dark across the frost. She thought about what she had said to him. I would like to be chosen rather than convenient. She had meant it. She still meant it. But watching him stand alone in that cold garden in the middle of the night, with the light of one lantern against all that darkness, she felt something move in her chest, something she had been very carefully not acknowledging for several weeks, and she held it the way she held everything important, very carefully, so it didn't break. She had written the letter as an act of honesty. She had not expected the honesty to cost her anything. She had been, in this, imprecise. He did not come to the library for 5 days. She noticed this the way she noticed all things, quietly, without making it mean more than it was. She went at 11, as usual. She read. She waited, without admitting she was waiting, until the clock showed 1:30. She returned to her rooms. She slept or did not sleep, and in the morning she continued as she always had. The accounts, the household, the garden walk, the dinner at opposite ends of the long table where his chair was present and his conversation was not. He was there. He was simply elsewhere again. In the in-between they passed each other in corridors with nods of correct acknowledgement. He appeared at breakfast twice, which was unusual, and each time he sat with a newspaper that he read completely and set aside and departed with everything as it had been. She poured her own tea. She did not offer to pour his. He did not ask. The house continued. The carpenter finished the east wing floorboards. Mrs. Bateman began the Christmas baking. Mary stopped flinching. Emmeline marked her calendar. Within the week, he had said. 5 days had passed. She was not counting. She was simply aware of the number, the way one is aware of the level of water in a glass, not with urgency, but with precision. On the 5th evening she came down to dinner and found a letter on her plate. It was brief. Duchess, having reviewed the terms of our arrangement and the legal circumstances pertaining thereto, I must inform you that an annulment at this time would present considerable difficulty for the estate and for the family's standing in the county. The arrangement was entered into under public acknowledgement, and dissolving it within the first months would invite speculation that would be harmful to both parties. I recognize that my position in this matter is not without self-interest, and I do not ask you to disregard that. However, I must request that you remain at Ashbourne Hall for the present term. The matter may be reviewed at the end of the winter recess. I remain respectfully, V. Ashbourne. She read it twice, folded it, set it beside her plate. The family standing in the county. She pressed her thumb along the fold. Both parties. The lamp on the table cast a warm, indifferent light across the white tablecloth. She was not angry, or rather, she was something more specific than angry. She was tired. She was tired in the bone-deep, unhurried way of a woman who has encountered this particular sentence before, in different handwriting, in different rooms, at different stages of her life. It would not be convenient. It would invite speculation. The arrangement must be maintained. She picked up her fork. She ate her dinner. She was on the 3rd course when Victor came in. He took his seat at the head of the table with the careful composure of a man who had prepared himself. The footman served. He poured his wine. He was, in every visible detail, exactly as he always was. She waited until Thomas had withdrawn. I received your letter, she said. Yes. He set down his glass. I wanted to... The standing of the estate, she said. Her voice was quiet, entirely steady. The family's position in the county. She looked at him directly across the long table and the candlelight and the 10 empty chairs between them. Those are the reasons. They are legitimate considerations. They are convenient ones, she said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. That cord pulled taut. Emmeline, I am not asking you to explain yourself, she said. You have every legal right to decline the annulment. I understand the terms I agreed to. I want the honesty of naming what this is. She looked at him. It is not about the county's opinion of us. You have never cared particularly about the county's opinion. A silence. He looked at the candle between them, at the small, steady flame. No, he said at last, very quiet. Then what is it about? She said. And here, this was the moment she would return to for a long time afterward. Here he looked at her, and she saw it, clear and unguarded for perhaps 4 seconds before the control came back down like a shutter. Something she could not name but recognized, something that lived in the body before the mind gets to it. He said, "It is about what is best for the estate." She said nothing. He said, "And for you, a position as a tutor, Emmeline, for a woman of your—" "Don't," she said softly. "Please don't tell me what is best for me." The candle between them flickered in a draught from somewhere. He was silent. She looked at him across the long table. This man she had not chosen, who had not chosen her, who walked his garden alone at midnight and read in the dark and had once said, "I notice books," as though confessing something. And she felt, clearly and without confusion, that she was more seen by him than she had been by anyone in a very long time. That was the terrible part. That was why the letter had been so hard to write. Not because she was afraid of leaving, but because she was afraid of what it meant that leaving had begun to feel like loss. "Until the end of the season," she said finally. He looked up. "I will stay until the end of the recess," she said, "as you have requested, and then we will review the matter, as you have said." She folded her hands in her lap. "Those are my terms." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "those are acceptable." She nodded. She lifted her wine glass, and they ate the rest of their dinner in a silence so full of unspoken things that it had the weight and texture of a conversation, the most honest one, she thought, that they had ever had. It found them 3 days later in the library, not the quiet library of midnight and dying fires. The afternoon library, in full grey December light, with Victor at the central table reviewing correspondence, and Emmeline returning a book to the east wall when she stopped, pulled the book back out and looked at its spine again. She had not come to argue with him. The argument came to her. "The Hartley matter," she said. He looked up from his papers. "You dismissed him," she said. "Last month, after the account discrepancy." "I did." "And the replacement you've hired, Mr. Carew?" "Yes. He has presented his first quarterly report." She set the book on the table between them, open to the page she had marked. "This column, the tenant improvement allocations, do you see this figure?" Victor looked. A pause. He reached for the book, drew it toward him. "The Penmore tenants," she said, "have been requesting drainage improvements on the lower fields for 2 seasons. The previous quote from the county surveyor was £60. Mr. Carew has allocated 45. She waited. £45 will not cover drainage. It will cover the appearance of drainage. The problem will recur within 18 months and cost twice as much to actually resolve." Victor read the column, read it again. "You've spoken to the tenants," he said. "Mrs. Foyle has a sister married to one of the Penmore farmhands. I listen." She paused. "I'm not overstepping. You said the household accounts were at my disposal." "I said household accounts." He looked up. "This is estate management." "The line between them," she said, "is less clear than you might prefer." His eyes sharpened. "Emmeline, I'm not trying to undermine you," she said. "Or Mr. Carew. I am telling you that your tenants need £60 of actual drainage, and they are going to receive £45 of gesture, and in 18 months there will be damaged crops and unhappy families, and a bill for 120. She held his gaze. "I could be wrong. I frequently doubt myself. But I am not wrong about this." He was silent for a moment, a very particular silence, the kind she had learned to distinguish from his others, not the silence of dismissal, the silence of a man who has received accurate information and is recalibrating. "How much of the estate correspondence have you been reviewing?" he said. "Only what comes through the household supply channels," she said, "which is more than you might expect." He sat back in his chair, looked at her with that full, steady attention that still, every time, arrived like something she needed a moment to stand in. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he said. "You were—" She stopped, chose the honest word. "Elsewhere." Something crossed his face. "I was avoiding you," he said, flatly, factually. The way he stated things he found uncomfortable, directly, because indirectness cost more. She did not react. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at the drainage figures again. At the book. At the neat, decisive markings she had made in the margins in her small, clear handwriting. "I'll speak with Carew," he said. "Today." "Thank you," she said. She turned to leave. "Emmeline." She stopped. "The end of the recess." His voice was careful, measured. "It is 6 weeks away." "I know," she said, without turning. "I would like—" He stopped. She heard the pause. The particular pause. The one that cost him. "I would like for the next 6 weeks to be different than the previous ones." She turned then. He was looking at the drainage report, not at her. His hands were flat on the table. "Different how?" she asked. He looked up. And for once, for the first time, he had no immediate answer ready. He simply looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the expression of a man standing at the edge of something with no map. "I don't entirely know," he said. She studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "The library. Tonight. 11 o'clock." And left before he could answer. He had refused her request for the wrong reasons. He knew it. She knew it. And now they both knew that the other knew. This, the shared knowledge of an unspoken truth, was more intimate than anything that had passed between them yet, and far more dangerous. He found them by accident. That was the part he would always return to afterward. The randomness of it, the way the most significant discoveries rarely announce themselves, but arrive sideways, dressed as something else entirely. It was the 17th of December, a Sunday, and he had gone to the east attic to locate a specific set of estate maps that predated the current survey and that Carew needed for the drainage review. The attic was large and imperfectly organized, the accumulated geography of 3 generations of Ashbournes, crates of correspondence, rolled maps, furniture under Holland covers, the detritus of lives lived and packed away. He found the maps within 20 minutes. He was turning to leave when he saw the trunk. It was small, plain leather, initialed in brass, EA, not old initials, recent, her initials. He should not have opened it. He knew this clearly and set the maps down and opened it anyway, because he was a man who had spent his entire life needing to understand things completely, and the trunk belonged to a woman he did not understand nearly as completely as he had begun to need to. Inside, letters. Not many, perhaps 40, perhaps 50, bundled in groups with thin ribbon. He picked up the first bundle, unfolded the top letter. He read the salutation. "My dear." He read the closing. "With all that I am, E." He read the date. November 1811, 3 months into her marriage to Charles. He should have put it back. He read the letter. He read them all. Standing in the east attic with the estate maps at his feet and the thin winter light coming through the small window and the cold settling into his bones, he read every letter in that trunk, and the man who emerged from the reading was not the same man who had knelt down and opened the latch. They were not letters she had sent. That was the first thing he understood. There were no replies, no correspondence back. They were letters she had written and kept. Letters written to a husband who had never read them, addressed to a version of Charles Ashbourne that Charles himself had never managed to be. She wrote about small things. A morning she had walked to the village and seen the first snowdrops, a book she had read and wished she could discuss with him, a conversation at a dinner party where she had wanted to catch his eye and he had been looking somewhere else. She wrote about her days at Whitmore Cottage, with the quiet precision of someone who found meaning in precise observation. The quality of light in the afternoon, the particular silence after rain, the way the garden looked in different seasons. She wrote about loneliness without calling it that, She wrote about hope, carefully, repeatedly, in the specific way of someone who has learned to tend hope like a plant that doesn't do well in difficult conditions. I think today might be different. I think perhaps I keep thinking, she did not write about anger, not once in 40-odd letters. He looked for it, and it wasn't there. Instead, there was something that was, he understood slowly and with increasing discomfort, much harder to read. The record of a woman who had simply continued to show up, continued to try, continued to care about a man who was not capable of receiving it. The last letter was dated 6 weeks before Charles died. I have stopped writing these, she had written. Not because I have stopped feeling them, but because I think I have been writing to the wrong person. I have been writing to someone I imagined, and perhaps that was always the trouble. I fell in love with a person who was never quite real, and the real one never had a chance because I was already committed to the other. I am sorry for that. I think, if I am honest, I have been grieving a marriage that never happened rather than the one that did. That is its own kind of loss. I am trying to let it go. I am trying to start again. He folded the letter. He sat down on the edge of the trunk. Outside the attic window, the December sky was low and white and perfectly still. He thought about Charles. He had loved his brother, imperfectly, at distance, in the way of two men who shared a father's damage and dealt with it differently. He had mourned him. He had carried the weight of that mourning for 14 months and arranged it as he arranged all difficult things into something manageable and contained. He had also blamed her. Not openly, not consciously, not entirely, but underneath the formal arrangement, underneath the correct and measured language of the letters and the dinner table and the library, there had been a residue, a quiet, unexamined conviction that something about Emmeline had made Charles unhappy. That her ordinariness, her quietness, her grey dresses, had been somehow responsible for the restlessness that had eaten at his brother in those last years. He saw now, sitting in the cold attic with her letters in his hands, that this had been exactly wrong. It had not been her ordinariness that was the problem. It had been that Charles, like their father, like Victor himself, like every Ashbourne man trained in the art of emotional absence, had never learned to see what was right in front of him. She had been extraordinary. She had been extraordinary the entire time, and the men in her life, himself included, had simply never bothered to look. He stayed in the attic for a long time. When he came downstairs, the estate maps were under his arm, and his face was entirely composed, and only Mrs. Foyle, who had known him since he was 7 years old, would have noticed that his eyes looked like a man who had been somewhere difficult and was not entirely back yet. She noticed. She said nothing. She brought him tea he hadn't asked for and left it on his study desk without comment. He came at 11. For the first time he arrived before her, or rather she arrived to find him already there in the chair by the west fireplace, with a book open on his knee and the fire burning high, and 2 candles lit on the table between the chairs instead of the usual one. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said. "I said I would," she said. She crossed to her chair, settled into it, pulled her shawl around her shoulders. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen before, or rather, an expression she had seen in flashes and fragments, briefly and always quickly covered, now sitting fully on his face without the usual management. Open, uncertain. Something she could not immediately name, but that arrived in her chest before her mind got to it. "I went to the east attic today," he said, "for the survey maps." She looked at him. The firelight moved between them. "I found a trunk," he said. "And with your initials." The room went very still. She did not speak. She felt the blood move to her face, not quite heat, not quite cold, but the particular sensitivity of skin that knows it is about to be exposed. "I read the letters," he said. "I should not have. I knew I shouldn't have, and I did it anyway." He looked at her directly. "I am sorry. That was a violation of your privacy, and there is no justification for it." She was quiet for a moment. "How many?" she said finally. "All of them." She absorbed this. She looked at the fire. "All right," she said, very quietly. "Emmeline, I'm not angry," she said. She checked as she said it, to confirm this was true. It was, Not because it didn't matter, but because she had written those letters for herself and they were true, and she had no particular terror of the truth being seen by someone who might understand it. What she felt instead was something more exposed than anger, more vulnerable. "I've been carrying an assumption," Victor said, "for 14 months, about you and Charles, about who was responsible for—" He stopped, chose a different approach. "I believed that his unhappiness was connected to the marriage." "It was," she said, "just not the way you thought." "No." His voice was quiet. "Not in any way that had to do with you." She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. "He was like our father," Victor said. He had been taught that feeling was something to be survived rather than experienced, and when it became too much, he turned it outward instead of— He didn't know how to— He stopped again. His jaw worked slightly. "I knew that. I knew it, and I still—" "You needed someone to be responsible," she said. "I understand. I did the same thing in that marriage. I was always searching for the error I had made, the thing I could correct. If I just found the right word or the right dress or the right way to be in a room with him, it would—" She stopped. Let the sentence stay unfinished. "There was no error," he said. "No," she said. "There wasn't." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed midnight. "I'm sorry," Victor said, not as social form, as something that cost him, that arrived from somewhere real and paid the price of arriving. "For the assumption. For the 14 months for not looking at you properly. From the beginning." She looked at him. He was leaning forward slightly in the chair, forearms on his knees, the firelight catching the line of his face, the jaw, the brow, the dark eyes that were, right now, the most unguarded she had ever seen them. He looked, she thought, like someone who had set down something heavy, like someone learning what it felt like to have empty hands. "You read all of them," she said softly. "Not accusation, just the fact of it." "Yes." "Then you know," she said, "that I am not easy to love. I know that. I am too quiet and too watchful, and I keep everything too carefully, and I have never learned to ask for what I want. Emmeline. And I wrote 50 letters to a man who never read them, because writing them was the only way I knew how to—" "Emmeline." She stopped. He had leaned forward and placed his hand over hers, both of her hands flat on her knees, with a gentleness so precise and deliberate that it arrived not as impulse, but as decision. His hand over hers, warm, still. "You are," he said carefully, "the most honest person I have ever encountered in my life." She looked at his hand on hers. "That isn't the same as being easy," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." A pause. "I have never wanted easy." She raised her eyes. The firelight between them was warm and steady. His hand did not move. She turned hers over slowly beneath his, not taking, not pulling, just turning, so that her palm met his. The quietest possible answer to a question neither of them had said aloud. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, not needing to. The fire burned. Outside the north-facing windows, the first snow of winter began to fall across the gardens of Ashbourne Hall, silently, without announcement, the way the most important things always arrived. She had written those letters for a man who never read them. And now the wrong man had read every single one, or perhaps she was only beginning to understand he was not the wrong man at all. She woke at 7 to snow. Not the suggestion of snow, not the light dusting that sometimes came in early December and melted by mid-morning, but real snow, deep and still, and covering every surface of the Ashbourne gardens with a white so complete it looked like the world had been given a new beginning and not yet told what to do with it. She sat at her window for a long time. Her hand, the one he had held, lay in her lap, with the memory of warmth still living in it, which was impossible and yet entirely accurate. She thought about the recess ending in 6 weeks. She thought about Bath. She thought about the Clifford girls, whom she had never met, in a house she had never seen, in a life she had constructed in her imagination as a shelter against a future she hadn't trusted. She thought about the library at midnight, and the snow falling outside the north windows, and his voice saying, "I have never wanted easy," with the particular quality of a man who was not performing sincerity, but simply, finally, telling the truth. She did not go down to breakfast. She sat at her window and watched the snow and held everything carefully and tried to determine what was real. December passed differently than November had. Not dramatically. Not with declarations or sudden ruptures in the careful architecture of their daily life, but differently, in the small, structural ways that mattered more than grand gestures. He came to the library every night now. They talked about books, about the estate, about the tenants whose drainage had been properly funded at £60 with Carew's corrected report. They disagreed about Wordsworth again, and agreed about the same passage of Keats again, and she discovered that he had a dry, precise humour that emerged only in the library, only after midnight, only when the formal coat of the day had been set aside. It arrived in one-sentence observations, delivered with absolute seriousness, that she would replay the next morning while reviewing accounts and find herself smiling at without warning. He began to take his breakfast in the dining room. This was, in the hierarchy of Ashbourne Hall changes, significant. Mrs. Foyle noted it with the expressionless precision of a woman who noted everything and commented on nothing. Thomas laid 2 breakfast settings with an air of careful neutrality. The first morning Victor arrived at the table and found Emmeline already seated with her tea and her book, and he sat down and poured his coffee and asked, without preamble, "What are you reading?" And she turned the cover, and he made that sound, not quite dismissal, not quite approval, and they ate breakfast in companionable reading silence for 40 minutes. She began to walk the gardens in the afternoon. He began to walk them with her, not every day, but often enough that she started to expect him, which was its own kind of change. They walked without urgency. The snow had frozen and then thawed and left the gardens in the pale, stripped beauty of deep December, and he knew the name of everything in them, not the Latin, though he had that too, but the local names, the family names, the histories of particular trees and hedgerows that had been there since the second Duke. He told her these things without sentimentality and without showing off, simply because she asked and he knew. She asked because she was genuinely interested. She was genuinely interested because she was beginning to accept this. She was genuinely interested in him, in the specific, complicated, unguarded person he was becoming, in her presence, at 12 paces from who he had been when she arrived. One afternoon near the 22nd of December, they stood at the edge of the fountain, frozen again now, the basin a smooth plate of grey ice, and he said, without looking at her, "The Clifford position." She was quiet. "Have you written to them?" he asked. "To confirm." "Not yet." A pause. "The end of the winter recess is the 14th of January, he said. He was watching the frozen fountain. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. "I said we would review the matter." "You did." "I would like—" He stopped, the pause that cost him. "I would like to review it before then." She looked at his profile, the jaw set in that way, the slight tension at the corner of his mouth that meant he was choosing words with great care. "All right," she said. "Let's review it." He turned to look at her. Snow had started again, small flakes, almost imperceptible, and one landed on his coat sleeve and dissolved. "I don't want you to go to Bath," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "That is, I am aware that what I want is not the relevant—" "Victor," he stopped. "Tell me what you mean," she said. "Not the legal terms, not the estate. Tell me what you mean." The snow fell between them in the cold December air. He said, "I mean that I have spent 2 months learning who you are, and I cannot. I find that I am not willing to—" He looked at the fountain, at the ice, at his own hands. "I have been, for most of my life, very good at being alone. I was trained in it, I chose it. I believed it was that I was built for it." He looked at her. "I don't think that anymore." She held his gaze. "That isn't a declaration," he said quickly. I don't know how to make declarations. I have no practice with them, and I don't want to say something imprecise when precision matters." "Then say the precise thing," she said. Another pause, the longest one she had counted. "I see you," he said. "I know that sounds—" He stopped. I know I did not see you at first. I know that has cost you something, but I see you now, I see you clearly. And I am asking whether you would be willing to, whether there is a version of this in which you stay. Not because you must. Not because the estate requires it. Because you... He stopped again, looked at her with those open, unguarded eyes, the coat of management entirely absent. Because you might want to. Emmeline looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The snow fell. The ice on the fountain was perfectly still. She thought about 50 letters written to the wrong man. She thought about the right man, standing in front of her in the cold, saying, "I see you," with the earnest precision of someone for whom those 2 words required significant personal cost. "I'm not an easy person," she said. "I know. I keep things too carefully. I expect too much from silence. I will find every error in every ledger you own and tell you about it directly." "I know." Something in his expression shifted, that precise, dry flicker. The estate needs that rather badly. She looked at him. "I'm frightened," she said honestly, "of being wrong again, of trying, and—" "So am I," he said, simply, without apology. She absorbed this. She looked at the frozen fountain and the snow and his hands and the line of his face against the pale December sky. And she thought, this is real. This is the real person. Not the one I imagined, not the one I needed him to be, the actual, complicated, difficult, trying very hard, real person. That was different. That was something she had not had before. "All right," she said. He looked at her quickly. "All right? I'm staying," she said. "Not because of the estate, not because of the recess." She looked at him steadily. "Because you asked properly." Something moved through his face, relief, and something brighter underneath it, something she had not seen there before. "I will endeavor," he said very carefully, "to keep asking properly." "You'd better," she said. He laughed. A real one, not the dry, contained half-sound of the library, but a full and genuine laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it changed his face completely. It made him, she thought, look exactly like someone who had just remembered how. She felt the warmth of it reach her before she could prepare for it. She did not look away. On the 31st of December, Ashbourne Hall received its first guests of the Emmeline era, Lord and Lady Pembridge, the Selwyns, 3 families from the county, and Mrs. Hartwell, Victor's formidable aunt, who arrived in a black carriage and entered the hall and stopped in the doorway, and looked at what Emmeline had done with the Christmas arrangements, and said to no one in particular, "About time." Emmeline had spent 3 days on the house, not because she needed to impress anyone, because she wanted to. For the first time in a very long time, she had wanted to. She had found, in the back of the greenhouse, a collection of forced paperwhites that Mrs. Bateman's assistant had been nurturing since October, and she had placed them everywhere, on every mantelpiece, on the dining table, on the windowsills of the entrance hall. Their white faces turned toward the candlelight like small, attentive presences. She had chosen red for herself, a deep, warm red in a wool that draped well with long sleeves and a high waist. Not grey, not half anything. Victor had seen her come down the stairs before the guests arrived, and had gone very still in the entrance hall below, and then said, with the extreme care of a man ensuring accuracy, "You look remarkable." "Thank you," she said. "I mean that as a statement of fact," he said, not, "I know," she said. "That's why I believe you." He had looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he offered his arm, and she took it, and the guests arrived. The evening was warm and loud, and full of the particular energy of a house that had remembered how to be inhabited. She moved through it beside him, not performing, not making herself small, not calculating the correct distance between herself and someone else's comfort. She introduced herself by her own name, and answered questions directly, and laughed when something was funny, and disagreed with Lord Pembridge about crop rotation with a cheerful precision that made Victor turn and look at her with that expression she had begun to recognize as his version of delight. Mrs. Hartwell cornered her near the fireplace at 10:30. "You've done well with the house," the older woman said, looking at the paperwhites on the mantelpiece. "Thank you." "Victor is—" She paused in the way of a woman choosing honesty over tact. He is not straightforward to know. No, Emmeline agreed. His father made sure of that. She looked at Emmeline directly. You are not frightened of him? No, Emmeline said. I'm not. Mrs. Hartwell considered her for a long, assessing moment. Good, she said, and walked away. At 10 minutes to midnight, Victor found her. She had slipped out to the east garden. The cold was worth it to breathe, and was standing at the frozen fountain in her red dress, with her shawl over her shoulders, looking up at the sky. The snow had stopped. The clouds had thinned. A handful of stars were visible above Ashbourne Hall, cold and clear and very far away. She heard his footsteps on the gravel and did not turn. He came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a moment, looking up. New Year in 10 minutes, he said. Yes. Are you well? Perfectly, she said. She glanced at him. He had followed her out without a coat, because of course he had, and the cold had put colour in his face that made him look slightly less like a portrait and slightly more like a person. You'll freeze. I've stood in worse cold. He looked at the stars. I used to come out here as a boy, when it was too loud inside. She looked at him. Was it often loud? Not in the way you mean. My father it was the kind of loud that happens inside rooms without anyone making noise. He paused. You understand that? Yes, she said softly. He was quiet for a moment. I want to show you something, he said. He nodded toward the far end of the east garden, where the formal hedgerows gave way to a low stone wall, and beyond it the open fields of the estate. There. She looked. Above the wall, above the dark silhouette of the fields, the sky was deeper and clearer than it was above the house, the stars thicker, the darkness more genuine, the kind of sky that required distance from lamplight to see. I used to climb that wall, he said, and lie in the field and look at that for hours. A pause. It was the only place where being alone felt chosen rather than imposed. She turned and looked at him fully. He was looking at the sky above the wall, and his face in the December night had the quality of the library at 3 in the morning, open, not managed, entirely real. Does it still feel chosen? She asked. He looked at her. Less and less, he said. Since October. The clock in the house began to chime midnight. The sound carried clearly through the cold air. 1, 2, 3, and in the windows above them she could see the warm tumble of candlelight and moving figures, the guests counting in the new year, and it was all very far away. She turned back to him. He was already looking at her. 9, 10, 11. Emmeline, he said. Just her name, just that. Said quietly in the December air with the precision of a man who had learned, recently and with effort, that some words meant more when they weren't surrounded by others. 12. She stepped toward him. Not far. 1 step. Close enough that the cold between them was replaced by warmth. Close enough that she could see the steady dark of his eyes and the slight unevenness of his breath in the cold air. She raised her hand and placed it flat against his chest, not grasping, not pulling, just resting there, the way you rest your hand on something to confirm it is real. His heart beat under her palm, fast, not composed, not managed, fast. He raised his own hand and covered hers, the same gesture as the library, the same deliberate gentleness, but different now, because it was not the beginning of something uncertain. It was the continuation of something that had already been decided. He leaned down. She lifted her face. The kiss was quiet, the quietest thing. Brief and unhurried and entirely without performance, the kind of kiss exchanged between two people who have already done the difficult work and arrived at last at the simplest possible truth. When they drew back, he kept his hand over hers, against his chest. Happy New Year, she said softly. Yes, he said. His voice was not quite even. For once, not quite even. It is. Later, she would not be able to say exactly when it shifted, when the arrangements became something else, when the careful architecture of practical necessity quietly became home. It happened the way all real things happened, she decided. Not in a moment, but across 1,000 small ones. A breakfast, a garden walk, a library argument, a hand over hers in the firelight, a name said quietly in the December air. She wrote one more letter, that January. Not to Charles, not to Victor, to herself. You stayed, she wrote, not because you had to, not because it was convenient or correct or the practical solution. You stayed because he looked at you and you believed him, because he said, "I see you." And it was true, and you knew it was true, and you were brave enough to let it matter. That, I think, is how it is supposed to work. She folded the letter, did not seal it, put it in the small desk drawer she had claimed as entirely her own. Then she went downstairs where Victor was in the library already at 11 in the morning, a new development, a December development, arguing with an open book about something she would disagree with, and she sat in the other chair and pulled the book from his hands and read the passage herself. "You're wrong," she said. "I am frequently wrong," he said, in ways that are apparently worth discussing. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the open one, the real one, and the winter light came through the north windows, and the fire burned at the east end of the room, and Ashbourne Hall was warm around them, finally, fully and genuinely warm. "Yes," she said, "they are." He had married her out of duty. He had ignored her out of habit. He had refused to let her go out of pride, or something he wasn't yet ready to call by its right name. And she had arrived with a grey dress and a letter in her pocket and 50 unsent words for a man who never deserved them. And she had quietly, methodically, without asking permission, made herself at home, not in the house, in him. And that, he would say for the rest of his life, was the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever done.
Black with grief, not free to breathe. A house of silence, cold and tall, where echoes answered every call. I learned to walk through rooms unseen, to fold my heart where it had been. A careful life, a careful role, a quiet woman with a careful soul. But winter changes everything when someone finally learns to see. You were the man who finally saw me, not the shadow I had learned to be. All the quiet years, all the words I never said, you found them waiting inside my chest. And when you held my hand, the world became new. Not the man I imagined, but the man who was true. The snow fell soft on Ashbourne Hall, like time itself had come to call. 1,000 rooms, 1,000 walls, and one man walking through them all. You carried silence like a crown, a king of space is locked and bound. But somewhere in that winter air, you turned and found me standing there. And suddenly the dark was kind, because your eyes had learned my name. You were the man who finally saw me, grave.